we are delighted to have with us today as she settles in, fresh off a train from Liverpool. Thank you, Sarah. We're not going to ask which hotel you're in, but but she's come. Sarah Holmes is an amazing lady. She really is probably one of the leading researchers into children and children's ministry and all things youth in this nation. And she's pulled together a lot of different research things, especially in lots of areas. But one of the areas Sarah's researched into is grandparenting, to look at the role of grandparents in the church, how senior leaders look at them, how grandparents themselves feel in different circumstances. And I know she's got some research that is pretty hot off the press that she's going to be sharing with us in a moment. But thank you, Dad, for what you shared. Those moments of stretching are moments where God is calling us. It's not all a negative thing. I think we can feel like we're at our wits' end sometimes, can't we? I kind of thought that most of the stretching happened when you were in your 20s until I reached my 30s. And then, you know, when the children begin to grow up and they think, oh, it's going to be easier now. But of course, each generation and each decade of life brings its own challenges and its own stretching. And I think one of the things I would encourage you with before I hand over to Sarah, so I'm just giving you a few minutes to catch your breath, is that the more you are able to navigate this season well with the Lord, the more the generations below you will be impacted.
Yes.
And so we have this privilege as we grow older of having more and more influence over those who are below us, even if we don't think we have. Even if it feels like they're not listening and we don't have any input into their lives and they're distant from us, that actually that we do have a huge impact. One of the things that came out of some of the research that Sarah did to do with parents, was it Sarah? Oh, it might have been the One Hope guys, actually. I think it was guys in One Hope. They discovered that the number one influence on children's lives was not the school where they spend most of their waking life. It was not social media, which we think, you know, that kind of internet's had the biggest impact. By far and away, the biggest impact came from parents. And as by extension, I'm going to say grandparents passing down that line as well. So it may feel like we're isolated in this strange, fast-paced world that we're moving in, but actually your impact is greater than ever in this season. And with that, I'm going to pass over. Sarah, are you ready? Are you happy to jump in? Thank you so much for squeezing this in. And I know when you've done your part, please do be released to get home to your lovely children and give them the time they need. I know you've been away overnight last night as well. But
I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you. So really, really happy to. So thank you. And I guess when I was sort of thinking what to share and what to say, I was just so aware of the wisdom that comes from all of you and with all of you, and the life experience and just all of those insights and so on. So I'm not at all coming with sort of any sort of answers or anything like that, but coming to sort of share some insights that actually I've just been listening to grandparents and collecting that all together, and I'll sort of reshare that with you. So I've been recently doing some research. So as Ali said, I'm very into research. And the reason why I love research is because it's a bit like an X-ray, I think. So we can perhaps see things that are always there, but perhaps hidden a bit under the surface. And so what I did recently was to do something called taking the pulse of ministry amongst children and families. So I'm just going to share some comments from that. We had about 2,000 responses to this survey. Some of you may well have taken part, so thank you if you did. And this shows all the different groups who responded to the survey. And what I wanted it to be was to ask all of these different people, you know, what is your experience? What are you sort of noticing about children, youth, families? And so they were all asked slightly different questions, but all to try and build up this sort of mosaic picture of what's going on in these ministry areas. So as you see there were 140 grandparents who took part in this. So I'm going to this evening share the findings from that little segment there. So it was this little bit I'm calling listening to grandparents. So I'm just sort of reflecting back to you what many of you said. And so this slide here shows, so we asked the question, what's your overall experience of being a grandparent? And they were text responses. Some were quite short, but the majority were quite long. So I had to sort of sort through and do what we call thematic analysis. So really looking at strands and themes to pull out. So this shows you on the right hand side which percentage, how many percent of the responses said these sorts of things. So it's really great to see that just under half, so 40% of the responses were positive. And these were saying things like it's an absolute blessing and it's such a joy and it's such a privilege and it's so great to be a grandparent and to be able to sort of be part of their life. And then you see, as we sort of look down, it's in descending order according to the other responses. So there were about 16% who talked about faith, sort of, and they said, well, it's great because I can, as a grandparent, I can input into the faith of my grandchildren, but also perhaps there was many comments talking about the ability to sort of come alongside and like Ollie was just saying, really, that sense of strengthening and reinforcing faith in the family unit. And so those were those sorts of comments. And again, really that sense of a real privilege that was. And then the third most common, well, same as the other one, 16%, was about attendance at church. And I thought this was really interesting because for the people who put this, for them, their way of passing their faith onto their grandchild was to take them to church. And some of those people reported positively and some of them reported negatively. And the negative was, I'm not able to take my grandchild to church. If I could take them to church, then I could pass on my faith, but I'm not able to for various reasons. But then some of them were positive and saying, I can take them and I'm able to take them. And often that was in the place of their parents. So if the parents didn't go to church, the grandchild's parents, the grandparents said, I can take them, and they're still getting that influence. So that was really great. 11% were saying about negative feelings and experiences. And this was probably things that would really surprise you about sort of various sort of challenges and struggles of time and distance from grandchildren and those sorts of things. Also lots of things about difficult interplay and tensions of different beliefs or different clashes of sometimes faith or sometimes other ways of just being family. And then 10% were talking about grandparenting in everyday life and saying how great it is, a bit like the sort of the Deuteronomy idea of, just when you get up, when you walk around, when you go to bed, all throughout daily life. And that sense that as a grandparent, I can do that. I can come alongside my grandchildren and input faith in that way. 4% of people talked about the lack of recognition of the role in the church. So I didn't ask about this, as I say, this was just general, what's your experience? And this is what people were saying, that there wasn't much awareness of that. And then a few at the end were saying more support is needed. So that was kind of the big picture. And I have got some other comments we can dig into if we want to later. But this was really interesting. I said, what barriers, if any, are there to doing faith activities with your grandchildren? And so the theme tonight is all about this idea of being stretched. And I think that this kind of really exemplifies this in terms of these are some of the things which stretch families, stretch grandparents, and that perhaps that relationship. So it was great to see that about 30% didn't have barriers. So that was really great. And I've got another slide in a moment saying what kind of faith activities they did do with their grandchildren. But probably again, no surprise, a significant portion, about 40%, said geographic distance was a big barrier. And what really struck me there was in these responses, people were saying, we live far away, so we can't. And I do wonder if there's kind of some room for people who create resources or that kind of thing to say, how could we resource families who are stretched in a distance kind of location way? What could we do to try and facilitate more kind of faith sharing in that distance way? Because there's obviously a big barrier there that people are referring to. You'll see here this green portion talked about unspoken reluctance from the grandchild's parents. So this sense of, I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about this, but I don't think I am. We've never actually spoken about it and that sort of thing. This small portion, about 5%, they had been asked explicitly not to by their grandchild's parents. And then some talked about a difference of beliefs, and some said about their spouse or partner being of a different faith or no faith, and therefore that. So it's kind of interesting there to see that geographic distance is the biggest barrier, but also perhaps this unspoken reluctance and these differences of beliefs and so on. Now, Becky Sedgwick helped me look through these findings. Many of you may have come across her before. I know she's been to one of your sessions here with Ollie and Helen, and so she helped me to pick through some of these findings and to say, actually, what do they mean for us as the UK Church? How could we sort of dig into them a bit more and sort of unpack them and so on? And so these were some of the recommendations that we came across. But I thought it'd be interesting tonight to look at these bottom two things and to kind of perhaps float them with yourselves and discuss them a bit and to see what sort of things you would think about it. So one is this idea of raising up grandparent champions in each church. And I think that's a really interesting idea. But I think that'd be really interesting in a little while. We'll go into breakout groups, and that's something to perhaps discuss. Would that be helpful? And what would that perhaps look like? Because I'm going to be doing some work next year with Becky and Parenting for Faith to try and put some resources together for grandparents. So it would be really, really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. But this other one at the bottom there, she says about further research to determine good practice in spiritual grandparenting. So that's the other thing I thought it would be good to chat about. What does that look like? And I'm asking you as people who are very experienced in this, in terms of you have grandchildren and you may or may not have dabbled in much in spiritual activities with your grandchildren, and that's okay, but it's really interesting to hear what your experiences are tonight. When we talk about good spiritual practices for ourselves and helping our faith to grow and to keep it alive and so on, what does that look like in terms of grandparenting? So they're two things that I think to kind of have pondering in your mind for us to discuss. And then these are things which the grandparents said they do with their grandchildren. These are faith activities that they are able to do. And so it's really great to see a good spread of activities here. It's very, very clear that these grandparents who did this, responded to this survey, are very active in terms of their desire and also their activity to help their grandchild's faith. So we see people praying for them and some praying with them, equal sort of amounts there on the left and right of the picture. And some taking them to church activities. I mentioned that previously, that it's interesting that for a significant number of these respondents, that was the main way that they passed their faith onto their child, was to take them to church or church activities. Some here we see on the green in the middle, about 10%, 20% discussed faith openly with their grandchildren. And then similar read Bible stories and similar, as I say, prayed with them. There was only a small number who didn't do any of them. And so that's really, probably again, no big surprise, but it's great to see that spread, I think, that diversity there. So here are some questions that I thought it would be really interesting to have a talk in breakout groups. Are we doing breakout groups, Ollie, or all just together in one big group?
I think we could. Let's do breakout groups for a little bit because it will give everyone a chance to speak.
Yeah.
And then we'll come back together. It's a small enough group this time that we can kind of pool ideas together. So we'll do maybe about 10 minutes in breakout groups and then come back together to share. Yeah,
that'd be great. So the things that I think it'd be really good to talk about together is this thing. When you're feeling stretched, how can you maintain that sort of spiritual role as a grandparent? And many of the stories that people were talking about were that sense of grandparents being that sort of foundation of the family, who are the sort of we are the spiritual foundation of our family, and our grandchildren know that we're we've got a strong faith in Jesus and these kind of things. And so But life kind of throws things at us. So when you're feeling stretched, I thought it would be really helpful to discuss together what helps you to maintain that spiritual healthiness, I suppose, and good spiritual health, and share some ideas, what habits, what practices, what principles perhaps help, any practical ideas. But then also, how could the church help more, or other grandparents at church, or other grandparents in the Christian community? So it's those two things. What things do you kind of hold and have as principles, but also how could the church help more when you're feeling stretched? So is that okay for things to discuss for 10 minutes?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Sarah.
Good. That segues us nicely on. Ollie, I was just going to share another little segment. Is that okay? Have we got time for that? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
we've got about 10
Um,
minutes.
yeah. So I was just going to share that exact thing. This is in terms of things that. So it's kind of perhaps taking us on to think. Actually, in your context, in your church, are there things which actually would be good to sort of champion for, and kind of, it's great to hear about some of these grandparenting groups and praying together and that sort of thing. Oops, sorry. But some of these things here were what the grandparents in the survey were saying they wanted as part of that kind of wider culture. And it's really interesting. You see there, a quarter of them were saying more awareness in Christian culture, more, and then the other, more openness, discussion in church, spiritual grandparenting in church, courses at church, online sessions or courses. And so everybody pretty much, well, sorry, apart from about 5%, were saying that this sense of wanting that more. And so whilst I and others are going to really try and sort of champion for this at a sort of a wider level, I do think in our each of your contexts, it would be really good to just think about actually how could you be sort of championing for other grandparents in your setting, and some of these principles or practices or activities or these different ideas, actually how to sort of share them and champion for more kind of discussion, just talking about it more in the sort of the church context. And this was a picture that I did. We won't spend time talking about this question, but I was just kind of thinking of the different sort of layers of it, and how actually perhaps at the family level, which we spent quite a lot of time talking at the family level, which is great and really, really important, but actually then thinking actually in your local church and perhaps wider as well, what can we do to change this culture to more speak about the amazing richness of that sort of grandparent grandchild relationship, and the impact that can happen in this whole space of passing on faith and so on. So that was just another one to kind of leave with you, really. So but that was, I'll be quiet now. That was just my final thoughts. Shall I hand back to you, Ollie?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. It's great to be back here. Thank you for everything you've shared. You've got us thinking. And thank you for everyone else who's thrown things into the pot. I'm certainly going to be following up with a couple of you, so you can watch this space. There's lots of really great stuff here. And it's great to hear these similar themes. I think one of the things about all of this, and Sarah, you're very welcome to stay to the end. But equally, if you want to get on your train through the puddles to try and make it home, then please do feel free to slip away. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate everything you've shared.